Morning all. I'd like to show you an absolutely phenomenal King's Indian defence game this morning, and because I'm a fan of the King's Indian defence, I'd like to show you from the black perspective. So this game was played in Brussels 1991. Playing white was the great Vassily Ivanchuk, and playing black was Artur Yusupov. Let's talk about Yusupov first. Yusupov was born 1960 in Moscow, USSR. Awarded IM title in 1977, GM title in 1980. He was a world title candidate 3 times running, losing the semi-final rounds in 1986, 89 and 92. So for many years he was considered like the 3rd best in the world, just below Kasparov and Karpov, a very dangerous player, and also a fantastic book writer as it goes. He's done some of the most celebrated instructional materials on chess as well. In the 90s, something happened to him which was quite bad. He was disturbed by burglars in his Moscow flat and was actually shot. He was lucky to survive. So soon after that, he moved to Germany, and he now works as a writer and trainer. He was German champion in 2005. Okay, so that's Yusupov playing black, and Vassily Ivanchuk, born Ukraine, IM in 1987, GM in 1988. Ivanchuk was born in Ukraine and been amongst the world's elite players for the last 2 decades. He's been a long-time world title aspirant, having twice been a candidate in 1990 and 2013, and has won many major tournaments, including the annual Capablanca Memorial Tournament 6 times, Linares 4 times, and Tau Memorial twice. So anyway, playing white, Ivanchuk plays c4, and Artur Yusupov just plays actually e5, and after g3 we see d6. Okay, bishop g2, and now g6. So will this go into a King's Indian defence? d4, knight d7. After knight c3, bishop g7, it is very much looking like a fianchetto variation of the King's Indian defence. Knight f3, knight f6, both sides now castle. Queen c2. Now black's play here looks very elegant and logical, just play rook e8. But on the other hand, white is also playing very logically with rook d1. And it already seems a bit frightening with this x-ray on the queen here. D takes e5 as a potential threat, but the rook and knight are supporting e5 enough, so c6 is possible here. White actually now plays b3, and one of the ideas is to put pressure on d6 like this from this diagonal. And you might think, well, the queen is not best placed surely on e7 here because it's going straight into that pin, and surely that will make d takes e5 a nuisance threat. Well, one side effect of playing a bishop to a3, a subtle one, is that it's not keeping control of the e3 square. So is that important here? And what about e4, e3? So is that really such a big deal for bishop a3? There's a kind of weakness of the last move associated with it, that it loses control a bit on this diagonal. An alternative, maybe bishop g5 and white's slightly better here. If the queen goes to e7 here, then even this sort of position is a nag for black. But black would have to do some manoeuvring and try and use the dark squares. But okay, we get this different game with b3, and it seems Ivanchuk's deliberately provoking actually e4 and e3 because he just wants to put pressure on d6 with this bishop. So let's see. Queen e7, and this really seems to ask for bishop a3. The queen doesn't seem best placed. If it went to c7 here, would this be any better? Maybe, this is a possible move. Let's have a quick look on Livebook. Actually, Livebook, surprisingly, queen e7 is the top move, 126 games, queen c7 only 17. e4 17, queen a5 13. So queen e7 is the top move here. And now it looks as though bishop a3 is logical, but it's not the top move. In fact, the top move is e4 here. stopping this pawn in its tracks, blockading it in effect. Another move is e3, which will at least stop e4, e3 from black. But this is very provocative, so that's 35 games with e3, 112 with e4, and only 12 with bishop a3. So it's quite a provocative idea, really. It's inviting positively e4, e3. Can this give black anything important? Well, it's tested now. If black doesn't do anything, then d takes e5 is pretty nasty here, with d6 being exposed from the blast of the rook and the bishop. So d6, the classical problem in the king's Indian defence. So e4, at least trying to shield the d6 pawn from the glare of the rook on d1. Knight g5, and now the pawn cannot be protected, it has to go forward. e3. Isn't it a thorn in white's side here? It's near the king. f4. Okay. Can it be made use of by Yusupov? So we see here actually now the move knight f8, and this looks like a very sensible move. It means actually that this bishop can see bishop f5 to attack the queen. It also means maybe knight g4 is pretty handy. Let's have a look at alternatives here. Is there any real alternatives? If, say, knight g4, trying to use the e3 pawn immediately, then white has the powerful knight ce4 on d6. That would be very nasty. That would be justifying that bishop here on d6. What does actually black do here? This looks very, very nasty indeed. d6 is dropping off. So how does knight f8 cope with that here, as was played? Well, knight e4 here, it can be answered with, of course, bishop f5 using that pin. So d6 is not entirely dropping off here. We can just use that pin here. Queen takes d6, and we've got that pin. So that's not possible. So that indirectly defends basically d6 to play knight f8 because of bishop f5 here. This seems adequate for black. So okay, after knight f8, d6 is seeing another day. We see actually b4 now instead. Ivanchuk starts to target c6 instead. If you can just use the scope of that bishop, c6 looks like quite a vulnerable pawn as well. Bishop f5, kicking the queen to b3 now, but still b5 seems a bit of a menace. Here black plays h6, which not just kicks the knight back but affords another idea, just not yet, potentially g5. But to make way for g5, we see knight g4. So now black is actually going to play potentially g5 and try and mine a way for the queen to get to the king side here. These two sensitive squares will be ideal to get an attack. This pawn is like an attacking resource on e3 in its own right. Any pawns near the king, Kasparov often considers as attacking resources, like attacking pieces. So is g5 a serious threat for white here? Well, Ivanchuk still targets now stubbornly the d6 pawn. He plays b5, and now there's actually an idea, because of that the pin is illusionary as Mitrovic would say. So knight e5 is also a potential threat to target c6, the wrath of c6 here. Should black be bothered by this? Nope. g5, carrying on, trying to undermine white on the dark squares here. And now, okay, b takes c6, b takes c6, and it looks as though, well, with this pin against the queen to justify this bishop on a3, we see knight e5 celebrating the pin. It looks as though c6 is dropping off. But the knight has just released control over these two key squares. Can black make use of this? That knight e5 carries with it a kind of weakness of the last move, as did bishop a3, that, you know, there was a pawn now on e3, but knight e5. Does this mean problems on h4 or g5 here? Well, what about c6? Isn't that going to drop off here? Black doesn't mind. He plays g takes f4. He's given himself the g5 square now. Very, very dangerous, surely. Knight takes c6, queen g5. But what of this pawn? Does it matter to drop this pawn? It's taken, and the bishop can sometimes defend, of course, on this diagonal. Has black got enough attack? Immediately f4 is threatened. Bishop takes f4 is a major threat. Also knight d5. So knight g6, at least defending against bishop f4 now. Okay, this is a very, very dangerous situation. If the queen comes to h4, if this pawn wasn't there, it's on h2, and it's on f2. Very dangerous. White plays now knight d5, and it looks as though knight e7 is potentially a menacing threat here. But there's also the h5 square here to attack h2. Can that not be just defended? It is played, threatening queen h2. Ivanchuk just plays h4. Provocative. Is he expecting a piece sacrifice? Is he underestimating the piece sacrifice? Or is he thinking that if he can win f4, this bishop's going to be defensive here? But what about the f2 square? The piece sacrifice is used to blast a route to the white king. Knight takes h4. Fire on board, as Shirov games often are. Fire on board here. What is going on now? And what about these checks on e7? Are they going to be useful? And what about this bishop potentially defending on h2? Okay. G takes h4 is played. Queen takes h4. What is black actually threatening though? The fianchetto bishop would surely mean white's not going to get mated. It's quite a useful defensive piece. There's also, isn't there a simple threat of just perpetual check if nothing else? We see white now playing knight d e7 check. Ouch! Surely it's winning a piece. Knight takes f5 is on the cards here, which will control the h4 square. Isn't that a total disaster for black? But wait a second. Engines even suggest this is not the strongest move that was played here. The strongest move might be to keep this centralized knight eyeing these two key squares and to play the other knight. So knight c e7 might even be stronger here to take, leaving this knight eyeing e3 and this knight controlling the h4 square. What would black have here? It doesn't seem like much. Check, king f1, and it seems very difficult for black. And there's a concept though still in this position. Black's best move, which is similar to the game. I don't want to mess up the concept of the game, but I just want to indicate that this position, the concept is not working. Let's go to the main line of the game and I'll show you the concept with the other knight. You'll have to trust me on this, that the engines indicate this isn't the strongest way to win the bishop on f5. But here I want to now show you the beautiful concept here. The perpetual check is ruled out, so queen f2 check is fairly hopeless. There's no check on h4. This is a lost position. The concept is to install the queen on h2, king f1, and here, okay, Artur Yusupov's move might not be the most accurate, but the concept is absolutely beautiful here against the fianchetto bishop. This is a classic operation around the defensive bishop, which many players will consider a fantastic defender quite often. But the principal threat, and I'll have to just show you this, it can be demonstrated with either bishop f6 or rook g8. If a rook is on this line, well, actually, let's show you here with, let's say, bishop or rook g8. Let's go with rook g8. And I just want to show you the concept. So let's just give a token move, which is not very good. Bishop f6. And now, just to understand the threat here. So these two moves are useless, but just to understand the threat, what would you play here with black to make the white king? This is the principal threat of this game, really. That's why I'm keen to test you here. If I give you 10 seconds starting from now, what could black play in this position? Okay, beautiful queen h1 is one of the game concepts here. For bishop takes h1 and knight h2, mating. Look at that pawn covering f2, The rook covering all the squares here. So it's this idea which is very, very interesting to black. And it does seem as though after queen h2 check, this might have been an inaccuracy. Rook e6. It's got the idea of rook g6, then this idea of queen h1 and knight h2. Possibly the engines are indicating bishop f6 or rook g8 might be more accurate way to do this. On bishop f6, it's difficult to see what white can do against this primitive threat. For example, knight ce7. Okay, seems very logical to go on g8, rook g8. Now let's go with rook g8. And this looks very, very dangerous. Knight takes, rook takes. We've got this huge threat here of queen h1. How does white defend? Say knight takes e3. At least getting the f2 square off the queen set doesn't work here. But knight takes king e1. Rook takes g2. And actually black is doing very well here in this position. Very well, very, 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 very well. So this is actually, very, very dangerous. Just to move instead of rook e6, just to move rook g8 or bishop f6. Very, very dangerous threat of rook g8 here. Needs to be for setting up queen h1. We see actually maybe not as effective move here. After the queen installs herself, we see rook e6. And okay, the concept is beautiful of queen h1, but the implementation here is letting it down a little bit. So white apparently, well, in the game, Ivanchuk played queen b7, so he's indirectly trying to defend here like this. But actually here, knight ce7, and if we get, well, it stops rook g6, it can just be taken. So that's the idea. How does black proceed? Rook takes, bishop takes. Now f3 looks very dangerous, but apparently it can be defended. This looks very, very scary stuff. In this position, it will just be a draw if king takes e2. But king e1 apparently offering the rook here. This is apparently good for white. This position is much better for white. To queen e2, queen f1, and white's better. Okay, but you can forgive Ivanchuk for trying to play queen b7 here. He doesn't like this f3 maybe concept either. Okay, black continues with rook g6. So now the threat is queen h1 and knight h2, but he's offering a whole rook. He's ignoring a whole rook as well. So queen takes a8 check, king h7. So white's got a huge amount of material and is faced with this kind of primitive threat. Let's say queen h1 is the primitive threat. Nevertheless, the piece is a bit far from the king, or is this queen like trying to defend here? But that's irrelevant here because of the queen h1 threat. Ivanchuk in this position is running out of defensive resource, believe it or not. What can he play here against this primitive threat? There are 3 pieces quantitatively against the king. Count the attack, count the defensive pieces. In fact, if you count this pawn, it's like 4 pieces. So, as Kasparov would say, you can sometimes just count the attacking pieces and the defensive pieces, and it doesn't matter if the opponent's material up. And this is a classic scenario. This really crude executionary threat of queen h1 to execute the king here. Ivanchuk tries a spectacular move, queen g8 check. He's trying to get rid of this rook tactically. So king takes, knight ce7 check. Okay, he gets rid of that attacking rook. But at the cost of the queen, f takes g6. Isn't the attack still continuing here? Knight takes g7. Okay, now it's tricky again. In this position, care needs to be taken. Let's see, if king takes is played in this position, the routine king takes, then what about the black king here after rook db1? The black king is being hounded here, surely. White's now threatening check and lots of checks here. So actually, in this position, black actually played knight f2, and what's the horrible threat now? The horrible threat now is actually knight h3 to be able to play queen g1, and this pawn is again attacking as an attacking piece, you know. As well, if the bishop takes, they've got queen f2 mating. So this is very, very dangerous now, this threat of knight h3. Ivanchuk plays now bishop takes f4. Does this help? Queen takes f4, knight e6. Queen h2. Black is actually doing very, very well now. Again, the threat of knight h3. Rook db1. Are these checks sufficient? Knight h3 is played now. Check. King g8. The queen is guarding here b8. Ivanchuk plays this anyway. Rook b8 to get rid of the knight. Queen takes b8, bishop takes h3. But now, again, we've always said this is an attacking piece. Queen g3, and it's a very, very useful attacking piece. It's going to be mate. Next move. There's nothing now white can do. A fantastic game from Artur Yusupov. He really went for it. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.